Good morning, everyone. So like we just said, we're up to chapter 2 in this book, Loving Like Jesus. Wonderful book. I encourage you all to read it. If you haven't got a copy, grab yourself one. It's well worth a read. Tony kicked us off last week looking at chapter 1, which was about the bankruptcy of the church. And he said something that I appreciated. He said he was going to try his best not to be too negative, which I really appreciated. So I've done a silly thing in the last 18 months. About 18 months ago, I signed up for a Twitter account. And I've gone deep into Christian Twitter, which is pretty dark. Every week, I hear about some scandal from a church, normally in America. Some big-name preacher turns out he's a grifter and a scumbag. And it's the same thing week in, week out. Every week, 2 or 3 new scandals. And it's depressing, but it's like a car crash. You kind of you can't look away. And I keep getting into all the details, and it gets pretty sad. And I've found myself over the last 18 months getting quite negative about the church. Just these stories on Twitter, just accumulation was starting to get me down a bit. And so I appreciated Tony doing his best to be positive last week. Now, last week I was at a funeral, and something was said in the eulogy that really struck me. It was a funeral for a family friend, and 16 years ago he had a terrible stroke, and he went from being perfectly healthy to disabled. And the last 16 years of his life, he's been in a wheelchair, been disabled. And his wife essentially became his full-time carer. And in the eulogy, she passed on her thanks through her son who gave the eulogy. And her son said this, that at the end of his dad's life, his mother's testimony was that God is faithful and Christians are kind. And it struck me. Not that God is faithful, I knew that, but her testimony was Christians are kind. And I'd gotten so bogged down in Twitter that it almost came as a shock. And I thought, no, that's right. In my own experience, here in this church for the last 25 years, that's my testimony too. Christians are kind. And yes, the church has developed a bad reputation. But I think it's important that we don't get too negative, because I think that's a wonderful testimony. And I think the majority of people who've come into this church would say the same thing. God is faithful and Christians are kind. So what we're going to look at this morning, we're going to look at a chapter in 1 Corinthians, chapter 13, which you probably all know. Anyone who's been to a wedding, you will know this chapter. It's often referred to as the wedding chapter or the love hymn. And it's all about love. It's really important though, before we read this, a couple of things, we need to get the context right. So we often think this is about, we might assume that Paul is addressing newlyweds here, based on how often it's quoted at weddings. But he's not talking about newlyweds, because he's talking about a type of love that goes far beyond newlyweds. He's talking about agape love, which is a sacrificial love of God. When you get married, it's a different type of love, because the person you're marrying is someone that brings out, you have strong feelings towards. They make you feel good. They bring about wonderful emotions. They're special to you. But agape love isn't about feelings. It doesn't discriminate. It's not only for people who we think highly of, people who've done something for us. This is God's love, Christ's love, who died while we were still sinners. And so this love does not discriminate. It doesn't pick and choose based on how other people make us feel. And in fact, really important that we think about the context, because Paul is actually talking about spiritual gifts. And he's talking to the Corinthian church that had a problem. They had become obsessed with spiritual gifts. And they'd kind of created this hierarchy, this ranking of what were the great gifts and what were the lesser gifts. And basically you were judged on how special you were depending on your giftedness. And they'd kind of got things all wrong. Let me read to you what he says, before we read this chapter, let me read to you what he says at the end of chapter 12. He's been talking about spiritual gifts. In fact, the whole book he's been talking about their issues with their lack of love. And he says, now look, eagerly desire the greater gifts. That's fine. And yet I will show you the most excellent way. So what he's saying is, that's fine, gifts are good, gifts are useful, but listen to what I'm going to say now, because I'm going to show you the more excellent way. And that's the context for this chapter. So let's start reading. Let's start with the first 3 verses of this chapter. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy, and I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor, and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but I do not have love, I gain nothing. What a massive statement. Paul's saying to Christians, to the church, if you don't have love, anything else you're doing is a waste of time. It's worthless. It's useless. I don't care if you can preach in the most persuasive, eloquent, intellectual way. If you don't have love, you're just a manipulator. I don't care if you're a philanthropist and you give millions. If your motivation isn't love, waste of time. It's all meaningless without love. Now, it's time for a bit of cow talk to make this point. And so I'm actually not talking about one of my cows this time. I actually want to talk about one of my grandfather's cows. So my grandfather was a farmer on the Darling Downs. And in 1960, he bought a famous show bull. Arana Stanley 6 was his name. And he was a champion bull at the Brisbane show. And it's said, this is actually not him, I couldn't find a picture of him, but this is a Hereford bull from that era. He would look very similar to that. This bull, it's said that he was as wide as he was tall. He was magnificent. And when he came into the ring, he attracted all sorts of glowing commentary about how spectacular he was, what he could offer as far as his impact on the beef industry. And my grandfather ended up buying that bull for a record price of 3,000 guineas. It was in 1960. Now, Google has an inflation calendar. I don't know how accurate it is. I put it in, and apparently that would be close to $40,000 today, what he paid for this bull. Anyway, he trucked this bull out to the Darling Downs in Western Queensland to put this bull to work. Now, back in the 50s and 60s, there was a bit of a fad where show bulls were really overfed. They were fed to the point they were really fat. They looked really good and glossy in the show ring, but it was pretty detrimental to their health. And when my granddad got this bull out of the truck and put him in a big, hot, dry, dusty paddock, this bull really struggled. He was used to people bringing him a tub of grain and a bale of hay every day, sitting in a shady shed, and now he's having to walk big distances out in the paddock. And he was so fat and so useless that he broke down physically. And he didn't breed one cow. He had one job to do. So this bull definitely was without love. Turns out, despite the hype, despite all the glamour and the glitz, and despite his good looks, this bull was absolutely useless. He was absolutely worthless. Arana Stanley VI was no good. And my grandfather never bought another show bull ever again. Now, I think this is very similar to what Paul is saying about the church. You can have a brilliant big auditorium. You can have dynamic preachers. You can have a website. You can have all the latest and greatest. But if you don't have love, you are useless. You're worthless. A church like that is like a fat, shiny Hereford bull who can't get the job done. So anyway, let's keep reading through this chapter. Now, if we come to verse 4, this section is probably the one we all know from weddings. And it's a beautiful passage. And it talks about what love is and what love isn't. And there's about 15 attributes there, and they are all action words. These aren't feelings or emotions, these are actions. These are things that can be seen and felt and experienced about what love is. Now, I know we look at this and we get all, if you might remember back to your own wedding or weddings you've been to, and this passage makes us feel maybe a little bit gushy and cosy. But I actually think it should be very challenging, and it should actually make us uncomfortable, because this is the type of love that we are called to, not just with your spouse, but to all people. This is what it says, reading from verse 4. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonour others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Now, if we go back to that slide again, what I want to focus on, because most of it's pretty self-explanatory, but I want to think about what it says there in verse 6. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Now, the reason I want to focus a bit on this verse is in my time in Twitter, I came across a horrific story about a mother in a big church in America, and the youth pastor in that church groomed her 13-year-old daughter and sexually abused her. When she came forward to kind of tell people what had happened, she was surrounded by people in the church who weaponized these verses and said to her, no, Christians shouldn't do that. You need to forgive and you need to forget. Christians don't keep a record of wrongs. We're gracious. And it was a complete distortion of what agape love is. Because a church characterized by agape love stands up to abuse. It protects the vulnerable. Agape love was never meant to be something to smother truth. It was never meant to be a cover for evil. Now, unfortunately, her experience is not unique. It happens all the time. Some scumbag pastor gets caught out, and the church gets manipulated with this idea of, well, as gracious Christians, we need to forgive and forget. We need to just move on. And it's an abuse of what this love is. In Hebrews it says God disciplines those he loves. So agape love and discipline in the church are not contradictory. The two can exist and they should exist together. Okay, let's read on. If we go to verse 8, keep going with this chapter. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they'll be stilled. For where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now, we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So this is a wonderful passage where Paul actually gets us to put our mind forward to a time when all of God's promises will be fulfilled in the new heaven and the new earth. And he's basically saying the only thing that will persevere is love. Everything else is going to come to a stop. There's no need for preaching. No need to gain knowledge. That'll be redundant. No need for prophecy. No need for healing, speaking in tongues. Those things are all temporary. They're all going to come to an end. They're not required. Even hope. There'll be no need for hope. All of God's promises have been fulfilled. There's nothing we need to look forward to. And his point is the only thing that we're doing right now that will stand and will last is love. It is the greatest thing, the most supreme thing. It is the only thing that's going to last and going to stand. And the reason is we will be with God, face to face. And he says here, at the moment I can see like in a mirror. Now we've got to understand that in the ancient world, mirrors were polished metal. Weren't nearly as effective as our mirrors today. When you looked in polished metal, you could kind of see yourself and you'd kind of get an idea if your hair was in a terrible state or not, but you really couldn't see a lot of detail. It was very obscured. We're saying now it's like looking into a piece of shiny metal to see what's going on. But there's a time coming where the veil is completely removed. We'll be with God face to face. We will see and know everything. And the only thing that will stand, the only thing that will persevere is love. Love is the greatest thing. And so we go to our next verse, the final verse in this chapter. He basically brings that argument to a close and he says, and now these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. These are the great pillars of the Christian faith. The most critical, most important three things. But he gives us a hierarchy. And he says the greatest of these is love. Now, anyone who's read chapter 2 in the book, the author gives us three really good reasons about why love is the greatest thing. First thing the author says is that God is love. God isn't hope, God isn't faith, God is love. That is his nature. And when we reflect his love, when we show agape love to people around us, we become image bearers and reflectors of who God is. This is what we were created to do. We were made in his image to reflect who he is. The second thing that the author says about why love is the greatest thing is because love brings heaven to earth right now. When we love with agape love, and we have a community that's characterised by God's love, the reality of heaven comes here right now. We get a foretaste. We get to experience a taste of the new heaven and the new earth. And finally, the author says the reason why it's the greatest is because out of these things, faith, hope, and love isn't for our benefit. Faith and hope benefit us. But agape love doesn't benefit us, it benefits the people around us. And this is why it's the greatest. And so Paul's point in this chapter to the church, and his point for us today is we've got to be so careful we don't get distracted and we start thinking that other things are more important than love. Getting a better building, getting a spectacular budget, getting better gifts. Those things are all good. They're all useful. But the most important thing, our highest priority, is love. Now, this became very apparent to me many years ago. It was 2003. Versa and I had only been in this church for a few years, and we went and lived in Canada for a working holiday. And we went there for 12 months. And I had this idea. I thought, when I go over there, one of the things I want to do, other than see lots of grizzly bears and snowboard and things like that, one of the things I want to do is I want to visit some really high-functioning churches. And I want to kind of see what makes them tick, and maybe I'll learn some clever things that I can bring back here. Some important learnings about how the really high-functioning, high-end churches work. And so that was one of my objectives. And so when we got there, we did some research, spoke to people to find out who were the top performers in the city of Edmonton of churches. Anyway, we had a list. We had about 4 or 5 churches on our list to go and visit. And the first church, the very first Sunday we were there, we headed off. And we arrived at the building. There was a sign saying, "We've moved." And I was like, oh, well, that didn't work. And we're driving home, and we just randomly stopped at this look, there's a church. It was like 5 to 10. It said 10 o'clock service. We thought, we'll just stop in there. And it was a funny little church. So we thought, we'll just go in here and have a look. Anyway, it wasn't a big church, but it was pretty full. And we had to sit right up the front. And as we're walking up the aisle, they were a bit of a motley bunch sitting in there. And every time we made eye contact, they would grin with this ludicrous, smile. And we were like, ooh. Anyway, we made it up to the front, and we were feeling a bit creeped out because they were so smiley. Anyway, they started singing. It was terrible. I think they were the only church left in the world still singing "These Are the Days of Elijah," and they were butchering it. It was awful. Anyway, then they got the announcements. The announcements took 40 minutes. Every old person's list of health complaints. And we're sitting there just dying. If we weren't up the front, we would have walked out. Anyway, the preacher got up, and he was smiling harder than anyone. And I couldn't work out what he was saying. I don't know if it was the accent, but it was gobbledygook. And I'm thinking, what is going on? And I just thought, I was up at the front, I'm going to look back and see if other people are as puzzled as me. So I'll just look back, and everyone's like... I was like, they're insane. They're all mad. Anyway, after the service, we got ambushed. And their big smiles were terrifying us. And they all started fighting over who was going to have us over for lunch. Anyway, we ended up going for lunch with the pastor, but all these people made us promise we were going to come to their place. We ended up going to about 3 or 4 people's houses. And there was an old couple there who'd been missionaries in Turkey, and we were talking to them, and we said, something came up about Turkish food, and Vanessa and I said, we really like Turkish food. And they said, we're going to make you a Turkish meal. And so we went over to their house that week, and this little lady spent the entire day making little Turkish delicacies. And we got there to this incredible banquet. So anyway, we just ended up going to this church. We didn't have a choice. They just absorbed us in. And about 3 months in, we're going there, and the services were still terrible. The people were lovely. And I thought I really should check out some of those other churches that I had on my list. And I went to a few, and they were really very professional, beautiful auditoriums, really slick services. But afterwards, nobody spoke to us. And it just kind of felt hollow. It kind of felt a bit empty. So we ended up at Braemar Baptist Church for the entire year we were there. They never stopped smiling. The singing never got better. So many things happened though. There was one young guy, we were telling him once we had some car trouble. And that afternoon he just turned up in his overalls with his toolkit and he's underneath our car changing a belt or something. And it made me realise, when I came back, it made me realise I'd gone there to find these clever strategies to how to make church better. When I came back, I realised there's only one thing that makes church effective, and that's love. And without love, it's a waste of time. It's nothing. We can do what we can to make our services engaging and enjoyable, that's good. But if we don't have love, Paul says it's like a clanging cymbal. Imagine if Ethan this morning got up here, just walked over there and just banged that cymbal for 10 minutes. Think how annoying that would have been. How unpleasant that would have been. And Paul said that's what church is like. Slick preaching, everything, but if there's no love, you're just like a clanging cymbal. It's empty, it's worthless. So anyway, I'm going to leave those thoughts with you and just encourage us that we should never get distracted into thinking that our strength lies in services and infrastructure. Nothing is worth anything unless it's characterised by love.
Why don't we stand?